you so much for having me here. I'm very happy to be in this wonderful place and wonderful town. And today I will be speaking on a subject which is both, I think, extremely niche and I think very relevant today, maybe surprisingly so, namely the trans feminine traits in the lesbian sex wars. And here, before I move on to the presentation proper, I would like to very quickly go over a few small definitions because I think they're important. So first, when we talk about lesbian sex wars or lesbian feminist sex wars, it is usually a term used to refer to a series of intra-community conflicts, mostly within the U.S., but also, generally speaking, English language, Anglophone, lesbian feminist world, which started in late 70s, early 80s, and are usually regarded to kind of petered out in the mid 90s. And those conflicts included a series of the best known conflicts would be over pornography, as the question of like whether pornography can be a valid form of expression, whether it's like anti-woman in general, but also a number of other conflicts, including the validity of butch-femme identities and roles, the use of dildos, and famously the question of lesbian sadomasochism, which has been central to the sex wars, but also often either overlooked or siloed off and treated as this like weird peculiarity of the time when the US lesbians argued very strongly about whether spanking your girlfriend is an act of utmost patriarchy or rather utmost liberation. And this is of course a caricature of those conflicts, but this is like very quickly. And when I talk about the trans feminine traits, I want to stress that I'm not just talking about the presence of trans feminine people within those conflicts, although they were present there, as I will show, but also I'm talking about presence of trans femininity, very broadly understood as like transition towards femininity or femininity in transition within those sex wars. And I will again hope to show there's a lot of that there, even if all the participants are supposedly cis. But don't take it from me. Take it from the indispensable Sheila Jeffreys, who we can always hope to just say the quiet part out loud and then shout it a few more times. And I've been like clued onto that there's something going on with the weird overlap between the anti-SM or the SM sex wars and the conflict and other like the other our conflict over trans people within the lesbian feminist community by the fact that a lot of the OG TERFs, the people who we now identify as central to the development of trans exclusionary feminism, people like Janice Raymond, people like Mary Daly, people like Sheila Jeffreys, people like Germany Greer, Robin Morgan, the list goes on, have all at various points also written very strongly against lesbian sadomasochism, have condemned those practices and seen them as highly pernicious, devoted entire articles, presentations, some activism to combating the dire threat that lesbian sadomasochism possessed. And I'm saying that Sheila Jeffreys is indispensable here because she makes the connection very explicitly and relatively early on, which is, I just love this quote, and this idea that SM scenarios, which include a male to constructed female transsexual whipping a woman, both dressed in fetishistic feminine clothing and black leather. And there's so much to unpack in this, and we will spend the rest of this presentation kind of like unpacking bits of it. So let's now loop back to the first trace and loop back to late 70s publication, What Color is Your Handkerchief, put out by the lesbian feminist collective Samoa in San Francisco, which is widely regarded as the first lesbian feminist collective to come together in the US, and which included a few famous figures. We should all recognize Gala Rubin, we should all recognize Pat Califia, or hopefully we all recognize them, or maybe I'm just, obsessed with my own field. Anyway, point is, and this is an excerpt from one of the essays in their first publication, What Color is Your Handkerchief? A slim 40-something page leaflet from author credited as Driven Woman, who links her pleasures of lesbian sadomasochism to her experiences in childhood. And this is this is why I'm going to just read it, because I feel like this is very interesting. So we took to writing our own scenarios. Usually they involve man and woman. Sometimes the cast was man and woman, and occasionally monster and woman. I wasn't that advanced. Basically, the rules were this: one of us got to be the woman, and the other got to write the script. Of course, both of us always wanted to be the woman. And this is, I think, extremely interesting because what it hints at and what it makes semi-explicit as being a woman here is not really just a statement of like identity or like political position in a strict radical feminist, like, but it's also a question of desire. We or both of us ostensibly cis woman wanted to be a woman in a fantasy SM scenario, which again, wanting to be a woman is a trans feminine thing. Though of course womanhood and femininity are not strictly coterminous, but for the purposes of this presentation, purpose of the slide, let's use them as such. And this is something which will actually recur throughout quite a lot of writing on the subject during the lesbian feminist sex wars. And my personal favorite is a story by one Martha Alexander, who published a short story in the collection Coming to Power, which was the second collection published by someone, which is basically a forced feminization scenario where a butch lesbian is being forced femmed by her girlfriend, made to wear frilly pink dresses, be a puppy, and generally speaking, like lesbian force femme puppy play. We've all been to Blue Sky. We all know that what this is about, but this is happening in the early 80s. And again, ostensibly cis lesbian community. And what is fascinating about that short story, which is rhymes with this, is that it treats becoming a woman in a like highly sexualized, highly fetishistic script as something very desirable, possibly mildly shameful. The butch in Martha Alexander's narrative is deeply ashamed of being rendered very feminine by her girlfriend and considers almost an act of cross-dressing, of transvestitism. And this kind of shows that the pleasures of feminization, which we often associate with specifically trans-feminine genres of pornography, of erotica, of fiction, have been present within lesbian SM writing, whether the context was transsexual or not, whether the context was transgender or not. There was always an idea there percolating that becoming a woman may be a sexual act and maybe a pleasurable sexual act. Becoming feminine, I would specify, like specifically feminization. And this is very important because it also like shows that this charge often lifted against trans women specific, that they are just fetishes who want to get off on feeling women, is again, hear it from the mouths of the ostensibly cis lesbians. They were also getting off on becoming women. So the history is there. But this is a history which has an interesting wrinkle to it, which also like kind of complicates this entire thing. So the other thing, this is from our beloved Gail Rubin. We love Adore and Icon. Also from the What Color Is Your Handkerchief? And the very interesting part here is the way she frames transsexuality in this, and she frames transsexuality strictly as a form of stigmatized sexual behavior, including in an enumeration of prostitution, pederasty, transvestitism, transsexuality, sadomasochism, pornography, and the kind of public cruising engaged in some male homosexuals. Transness here is for Rubin in the late 70s a sexual act. And this is again something which will recur throughout the writings in lesbian sex wars on both sides of the debate. So Pat Califia will, for example, speak in Coming to Power of pedophiles, transvestites, transsexuals, tea room cruisers, and hustlers. Again, creating this list. And then some viciously anti-trans, anti-SM writing will also include a similar list. And this is important because this kind of like predates the conceptual and political cleaving of sex from gender, on which a lot of contemporary trans discourse is predicated on the idea that one's gender identity has nothing to do with sexuality, very little to do with sexuality, and in general that sexuality and gender are highly limited. In this specific case, however, sexuality and gender are tied together, and I feel like it kind of ties together around the idea of this pleasure of sex in both meanings of the word. The sex before it was split into sex and gender. And this is partially also because, and this is very quick note, that issues of transness and the record of the sex wars are constantly talked about alongside the issues of bisexuality. Namely, the question, for example, is not whether trans women can be included in lesbian SM organizations, although this was widely discussed in the 80s, but whether trans women and bi women can be included. And similarly, this is something that will again last into the mid-90s, where there's constantly this discussion whether can we let into our lesbian communities the two other kinds of sexual women, bisexual women and transsexual women. Also, interestingly, most organizations, lesbian SM organizations which cropped up in the 80s in the United States, ended up being inclusive of both. And the ones that were exceptions, such as the Outer Limit in Seattle, were exclusive of both. So if you don't let the bis, you also don't let the transes. And this is also where the TERFs return, really, or where we kind of like return. And this is from a 90s collection, Unleashing Feminism, which is genuinely dreadful. It's one of the like most also anyway, no time for that. But it is interesting that this collection, which is like supposed to be this reiteration of the radical feminist stance against lesbian sadomasochism, devotes an entire section of it to the fact that transsexuals are back. And the transsexuals being back, transsexuals, mostly meaning trans women here, because this is before trans men were invented, are back, and therefore the lesbian sadomasochism is also back. Transsexuals are lesbian sadomasochism. They're like coterminous. They both represent the same. They both represent the same threat to the lesbian separatist politics, to lesbian separatist idea of the world, to the idea of what it is there to be done. And I think there is a way to weave it all together. And to weave it all together, I will reiterate, we need to mend the split of sex from gender. I stand here and I agree with writers such as Ima Heaney or Jules Peterson, who have been highly critical of the way that the concept of gender has been deployed in trans and queer discourses, in the way how it serves to at times strip trans people, especially of the fact of their embodiment, of the fact of their sexuality. But in this particular case, I think what is key is that what those trans feminine traces I have outlined show is that the stakes of the lesbian SM sex wars have not just been about sadomasochism in particular. It's not just been about whether spanking your girlfriend is okay or whether spanking your girlfriend makes you a fascist or worse than fascist. Just the idea that if you do SM, you're basically a Nazi is very relevant, or an inquisitor is very relevant in those texts. Anyway, the stakes go deeper, and the stakes go to the right to sex. But sex, again, not just as a physical act, as an intimate act, but sex as a pleasures of being sexed, of being sexual. The right to enjoy your femininity, masculinity, things that we would normally refer to as, of course, as gender, but to enjoy them here in a sexual manner. And this is also why there's such overlap, at least I would argue, between the anti-SM, anti-trans, and anti-butch femme positions. Because what is being criticized here is the idea that sex, the sexual distinction, sexual roles, sexual pleasure can be a source of pleasure, can be a source of, I hate the word, but let's use empowerment, can be a source of thriving, What the anti-SM, anti-butch femme, anti-pornography, and so on positions criticize is the idea that we can enjoy sex in a world of sex inequality. And this is, 2 last sentences, please. And this is why I think this is what is relevant about the sex wars today, because the question of the right to sex is a question which remains with us to this day, whether we refer to as gender or sex, but the problems that have been raised 30, 40 years ago remain, and there remains also the idea that if you are enjoying your sex, you are a danger. So, thank you.